Hi, welcome back to my talks. Today we're going to be talking about sexism, and first we're going to dip into the physical differences between males and females, and then beauty standards. Then we're going to talk feminism, and then this new phenomenon, feminism. And we're going to end every video in the I'll Sleep When I'm Dead series with hypothetical ideals for harmonious coexistence. I chose the title for this series because I'm a mixed race, bisexual woman. Inverted misogyny is a thing, black supremacists are a thing, white supremacists are very well known all over Western society, West Asia and North Africa. I don't know much about the general trends in East Asia and Russia, but I know globally homophobia is still pretty common. And as far as I'm aware, China is the only country where matriarchal households tend to be the general rule. However, this doesn't extend to their government. Britain is relatively progressive, and civil rights in this country are arguably one of the best, if not the best, in the world. I think our civil rights should be human rights, which are global. It's definitely a good place for the trans rights movement to find its legs, feet, whatever the saying is. I'm more an online protester because I get sad rather than angry because of injustices associated with respect for life. I might have to do a video on gender separately. Anyway, as children, we're discovering and exploring, but we don't tend to internalise that any superficial differences should mean division until later in life. Outside of public bathrooms, obviously children have people they get along with and that they don't get along with without any maladaptive prejudices. But we're told when we're learning to talk with a boy or a girl, him or her, that's his or hers. We're assigned gender based on sex. I'd love to talk to someone whose sex is defined as hermaphrodite or intersex, according to the genitals, or their parents about their experiences and observations throughout their life. Having both for ambiguous genitalia is very uncommon, as is having sex characteristics that don't fit the typical definitions of male or female. I wonder how they choose their gender, if they choose a gender rather than identifying as non-binary. Children tend to be pretty equal regardless of gender as far as physical development and aesthetic differences. While I was growing up, we're usually dictated by the parents. We play what games we want and with what toys we want until someone tells us that's for boys or that's for girls. And the same applies to the media, although most children's TV, books and games are non-gender specific in the target market. While I was growing up, it was uncommon to deviate from the standards set by the generations before us. It was expected of girls to do housework, sew and take care of their appearance, and it was expected of boys to build and fight and call the shots. But that was around puberty, when adults have had enough of all the childish nonsense and decided it was time to start preparing for business. At puberty, the hormones in both males and females start to change. Female estrogen levels and progesterone levels change, and male testosterone levels change. This causes female hips to widen, breasts to develop, and periods to start. And males usually shoot up and muscle density increases. The changes that happen during puberty are what define gender. Men tend to be stronger and faster than women, which means women have to train much harder than men to match men's strength and power. And the hormone fluctuations in women during the menstrual cycle means that we can be much more temperamental than men from week to week. It's less noticeable in some women than others, but feeling like you're getting punched in the uterus and your blood is falling onto your vagina is bound to put you in a bad mood. I recommend chocolate and ibuprofen. The genitals post-puberty include what we're expected to want out of life and how you're expected to behave in some cultures. I was a new carer, so most of this was a given rather than a societal expectation conformity moment. My mum fell ill when I was 7 and my sister left home after being back and forth between local relatives' houses and our childhood home for a couple of years when I was 10. So I learned to cook and clean and started making my own way to and from school by the time I was about 8. I'm the younger, so I wasn't expected to care for anyone other than my mum. Before my mum stopped working, me and my sister did ballet and I did tap and my sister did jazz. I was introduced to the Charity Bernardos when I was 11 or 12 and they picked up the slack as far as enriching extracurricular activity expenses for several years. Gender roles weren't a thing with this charity. The boys and girls were invited to and participated in all the activities offered to us. I also took myself to a youth centre and my sister introduced me to where I got really fun dance lessons and my school paid for my piano lessons, which I loved but it's always frustrated me because I still can't read music. I might have to finish where I started. Really impressive that people get on a piano and look at a piece for the first time and play it perfectly. Same. I was really into football in primary school, but it wasn't available as a team sport for girls in senior school. We played rounds of netball and boys played football and basketball. Physical education was slightly more inclusive in that everyone was expected to do swimming lessons, athletics, and I think tennis and badminton. But boys and girls obviously did PE separately throughout school. Senior school. When I was 9, I bought an eyeshadow palette from class and my mum confiscated it from me. When I was 14, I got caught stealing makeup from a supermarket. My dad told me wearing makeup was like putting on a bag over my head. Some of my friends growing up and some of my ex-colleagues are makeup artists. I might do a whole separate video on beauty standards set by the media in the last century. But I think the most important thing to emphasise in the context of sexism is clothing and makeup. After all, a pixie cut was popularised by Audrey Hepburn in the 1950s, and there are many women who have taken it to the extreme of rocking a buzz cut. And there have always been men who grow their hair out. So despite what's most common, I think it's fair to say hairstyle is non-gender specific. And the stigma of deviating from the norm is fairly minimal, generally speaking. Scottish kilts, despite their origins so far ahead of the time, it's insane. Men's caftans, definitely impressive considering the prevalence of sexism in the culture they come from and the sexism incorporated into their laws. The ancient Greeks were all over heritage. Homophobia and I think sexism weren't a thing. Stunning culture which was all more. I think pants weren't a thing now. Worldwide society should have been built on ancient Greek philosophy, in my opinion. Women started publicly wearing pants and suits around the 1920s, and the approach to feminism where women adopt conventionally men's aesthetic has been embraced all over Western society, since the traditions are a patriarchal construct and choices could be considered freedom. Traditionalists who seem to lack self-awareness make it hard to stray from these customs, and the conformists, some of which also seem to lack self-awareness, aren't quiet when applying social pressure, seemingly for the sake of getting validation. Like it's brave to put on a face of makeup or a dress or skirt with a penis between your legs, so it's important that we celebrate these people. After all, we wouldn't have made the progress that we've made without the men who joined the protest and betrayed their gender as a matter of perspective. What I think we all need to internalise is that gender is a social construct. I think the gender dysphoria prior to sex changes will be much less agonising with this accepted by people who think this social construct is the natural order. And transgenders could be accepted like cisgender women who get breast enlargements, reductions, fat transfers, beauty shots, liposuction, lips, Botox, facial reconstruction, and all of that stuff. Although there are people who are anti-plastic surgery generally speaking, I think validly because affordability still limits some people who look at it if it were cheaper, and also because of the point of view that beauty standards distort people's perspectives. I've heard some people say, how can you have a child and call them beautiful or handsome if you can't learn to love your aesthetic? Or something along those lines. Which is an annoyingly fair perspective. Body dysmorphia is far too common, which may sway some people away from plastic surgery and low beauty standards set by the media. As far as I'm aware, plastic surgeons don't work on people with certain psychological issues they think they could change by changing how they look anyway. I'm guessing they recommend antidepressants to help them to try hitting the gym. I don't know, I can't afford the consultation and around the surgery. I did have a non-invasive procedure on my ass before I recovered from the eating disorder while I was working, but the eating disorder completely reversed the effects. Body modifications, generally speaking, have become much more normal. Some may say popular. It's much more common to see facial and body piercings, and I don't think I've ever left the house without seeing tattoos. Personally, I have a load of areas that I want tattooed, but only 3 tattoos so far and 11 piercings, with 2 more left until I'm done. My earlobes were inspired by a friend's goal. A friend's ex has her nipples pierced, and my sister has one nipple pierced, and of course Kylie Jenner made them popular. And I wanted work done on my breast since I was about 12, so I thought the nipple piercings would change my opinion on my breasts, and the nipple bars and belly bar have definitely got me closer to the level of body confidence I'd like to go at all times, but I'm still not there. I feel like considering a belly bar was inspired by the dancers and models in music videos, and that I'm an artist myself, that's the confidence goal. My mum's a feminist and was a brainwashed closet lesbian rather than a self-loathing closet lesbian until her 40s. She thought she was damaged rather than that her sexuality was the issue. So feminism has always been a big part of my life. I studied the women's suffrage, but this was 12 years ago. So there's been more movement and we've made more progress since. The fact that I can talk about it on the internet might be considered a miracle. 150 years ago, women couldn't vote. 50 years ago, the Sex Discrimination Act was passed. 15 years ago, the Equality Act strengthened existing legislation. 10 years ago, women paid approximately 14.4% less than men for the same job, and last year, 13.1% less. Tradition in a lot of different communities all around the world, despite not being illegal and not always being unwelcome, may be said to reinforce the validity of the inequalities like these. Some strongly imply that women are useful inanimate objects born to serve, like in communities, teenage women are expected to marry men in their 20s, 30s and 40s. In some countries, this is actually legal, and there are approximately 150 countries with at least one law that's different for men and women, and 63 with 5 or more laws different for men and women. Hopefully, I remember to mention them in my next video in reference to rape culture and consent, because while we have a long way to go in the West, there is much further to go legally and socially in many places all over the world. And people are protecting guilty consciences and entitlement to violate instead of protecting people from persecution. It's sick. Because of the variation of extremes when considering sexism from the black and white equality perspective, there are obviously a range of approaches to feminism. I can imagine there are debates about whether it was a man or woman who did the first cave painting or lit the first fire. Pettiness, irrelevant to the inequalities that are detrimental and limiting collectively as well as to individuals today. I have to admit, while I won't condemn extremist feminists, also known as feminazis, I don't approve of the approach. Feminazis can often be found calling other women anti-feminist for taking advantage of the choices given to them by feminism in this country, which is anti-feminist in itself. The freedom is the point. Probably out of frustration from the people who don't want to be associated with feminism or anything controversial according to their background, out of fear that speaking up will make their situation worse. Feminazis seem to think that feminism is misandry, hating men or anti-men, and anything they might want or enjoy from women, and that's not the point. The feminazi approach seems to create a vicious cycle that slows progress and results in misogyny, where men who are guilty of consciously showing prejudice or discriminating get to a place where they don't trust or like any women and internalise that every interaction has a hidden motive meant to violate them in some way. I'm guessing that from the reaction of a few people I've said I'm feminist to and debates I've listened to. Like they're at war, expecting the worst from anyone associated with the cause. But the people who tend to venture to that end of the feminism spectrum have usually dealt with multiple men who have hidden motives meant to violate them in some way or have experienced or witnessed extremes of sexism. Hence, vicious cycle. I think the feminist movement, which already consists of multiple groups organising and protesting, might be a product of the feminazi approach. It could also be a result of the pressure from expectations of men raised in traditional households, like the pressure to earn a high income or be the sole provider for the household, young men being told they're the man of the house and parentified as children or teens, men and boys being told not to be emotional or man up in the context of a little boy hating himself or being tired and weepy or seeing his head across holding hands with someone else. I think most adults all over the world are expected to maintain some level of composure regardless of what they're going through. True feminists, which I consider myself up until my mid-20s, are fair and aren't interested in telling other people what they should or shouldn't be doing, are interested in seeing everyone, regardless of their gender, treated fairly and their freedom of choice protected. Not to say I'm unfair now, it's just that humanist covers anti-racist and anti-homophobia and anti all the other forms of bigotry, which I always have been. I didn't know what it was called, but I never left nursery as far as prejudice against any marginalised groups go. I haven't always been politically correct, but that's either been humour or meant to insult an individual who's pissed me off. My primary school and second senior school were probably one of, if not the most found out for the sake of banter, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't join it. Anyway, back to feminists who don't actually make sense to me. Their complaints are all about patriarchal constructs they seem to be tired of. You know, all this stuff put in place, the social constructs meant to ensure men stay in power in the bigger picture and in control zoomed in. Like men being pressured into finding high income jobs, that's so men can train their partners historically so they can financially abuse the wife that potentially didn't want to be with them, who's dad forced them to marry for business or something along those lines. When she's not doing what he wants, keeping her under his control. Also, the high income expectation is so women are easily oppressed into prostitution, which allows them to set the price for her and creates a sense of desperation that creates the on-call vibe. Men being expected to be independent as a given, that's so they never depend on any woman other than their mothers. Maybe sisters and cousins in some communities that accept these social constructs. Men being at a disadvantage in family court systems, partially because of the gender role, also backed by the psychology of women as carers, partially so they're not burdened by having to always put their child first and have to make compromises to emotionally and physically show up for them on a daily basis, never mind when things go wrong. They being the majority of homeless, drug addicts and suicides because they're taught not to let their guard down and show vulnerability, which sometimes allows people to manipulate and take advantage of you, but also allows you to heal. The system, which is globally dominated by men, would obviously rather see men under their care and supervision regardless of the distance or dead than see them dependent on women, which is ridiculed in less progressive cultures. Some of these forms advocating domestic violence, encouraging men to hit women, which has resulted in us being encouraged to arm ourselves. My guess about men being the majority of school dropouts would be that men and women's ADHD symptoms usually present differently as general trends and from individual to individual. However, globally, the statistics confirm men are dominating the workforce, which I expected considering the structure of the patriarchy and how it's maintained. I watched the Red Pill men's rights documentary a few years ago, probably around the same time it came out, and going back to refresh my memory, I got about 2 minutes in and turned it off and turned on a debate instead. I got flashbacks of watching it in horror and thinking to myself, these people are fighting to reverse progress and they think they're doing the world a favour. I haven't fact checked most of the statistics about men I explained, and they came from the intro of the documentary. One thing worth considering when opening up conversations about feminists is that men who were born before 1970 were born with a strong sense of purpose to provide. Women's presence in the workforce being much more prominent from this decade on may have given some of them an existential crisis despite inflation, meaning that most households can't manage on a singular income, hence child support, and I think it's called alimony in America, which seems to have taken the wage gap into account when writing the legislation that enforces payments. I think that's all I've got to say about feminism, but feel free to get heated in the comments. I can't help but try and break down the root cause of these issues. My theory is that, bigger picture, someone decided that the responsibility is the continued survival of our species should be divided by gender, rather than character and passion or areas of interest. And the maintenance and improvement of the system our ancestors must have created to ensure our continued survival, obviously being the point of the causes mentioned in the video and the video itself. Smaller picture is about each couple, household or family's dynamic being between those individuals. Compatibility and comfort are far too rare and should be cherished by communities. The couple's households or families always do when it's mutual or collectively. understandably so. Forget what literature tells you that you and your loved ones should want, and focus on self-actualization in every area that can be ethically controlled. We are social animals after all. Acceptance of differences accommodates the socialization that keeps us sane. And every individual is one of a kind, regardless of how much or how many shared characteristics, passions, and or areas of interest we have. Defining and respecting boundaries and talking about wants and needs and feelings seems to be really important in the context of staying in long-term relationships. I've never had a conventionally successful one though, so that's a guess. Another way of dealing with the issue would be treating gender roles how Germany treat uniforms since World War II, as if it's taboo to suggest what anyone should or shouldn't be doing or saying based on gender. I tried to get this video done in 2 weeks, and it's taken as long as it's taken, so I'm going to carry on with it. The work gets finished when the work gets finished, which usually exclusively applies to my music. I'm thinking sexuality is a good follow-up video considering what's being discussed in this video. Thanks for watching.